And I've been able to visit and listen with a number of folks over the last few days, and I'm glad for that. I do like the fellowship. I do like the hanging out. And the saying hello and meeting new folks. I know some people over the years, and some are new to the program, and maybe you haven't met me ever before, so let me give you some data so you can get me on your grid. I notice a lot of folks here give sobriety dates. We don't do that where I live, but it's not bad. We just don't do that where I live. In Texas, they say if you don't give your sobriety date, it's because you don't have a sobriety date. And but anyway, my first day without a drink was the day that Gerald Ford was nominated for President of the United States. So that's my sobriety date. It was a Wednesday in August. It was the bicentennial year. It was the year that the third edition of the Big Book came out. And I got a third edition of the Big Book. And one of the people that I became great friends with over the years had he got sober at the same time, but a month later. And they gave him a second edition of the Big Book, so I've always felt more advanced than he because of the 28 days and the third edition of the Big Book. Grew up in California, and I've heard, some folks make the California references. What you might not know is that we in Northern California barely talk to the people in Southern California. You might not know that. But I want to carry that resentment with me into Cal. They take our water and they make us ration, and there's a lot of problems. So, I'm 64 years old. I got sober when I was 29 years old, and I knew nothing. I'd been in school forever, but I knew nothing. I'm a member of, there's alcoholism in my family. A part of the family, Irish Catholic Democrats and Swedish Lutheran Republicans, and we just talked around alcoholism a lot. We never used the word. On the Irish Catholic side of the family, alcoholics were called characters, and they'd say, "Oh, so and so is such a character." And I've met some right from the old country. I mean, we're off the boat. We're new immigration in this country. So my cousin Sean, such a character. What that really meant was do not let him drive. That's what it meant. And the Swedish Lutheran Republican side of the family, we didn't have alcoholics either. We had nervous people. And I'm the youngest, a big Swedish farm family, and I'm the youngest of a lot of cousins. I was a little boy, and my first cousins were married with kids my age. I mean, it's that kind of age span. And every other one's alcoholic, and bad alcoholics. And so I didn't know much about alcoholism when I got here. I didn't know how to talk about it. I have a tendency to talk around things, to use circumlocution, to use euphemism, to use a lot of fancy footwork rather than tell the truth. And I was kind of raised like that. And I was attracted to meetings because where I went to meetings, the truth was told simply and directly. And it was such a change. It was oxygen. I joined the Jesuit community when I was a young man. I was 18. I'd been drunk. I'd been in love. What more is there? So I joined the community, and I was taught by Jesuits, and these were bright fellows, and I was drawn to being a teacher. I liked that kind of life, and I had a vision of ending up teaching school for my whole life, and that would have been fine with me. And I went through the stages of alcoholism that Dr. Gill would talk about. And we have some sober physicians on the West Coast, and I have learned a lot from listening to them. Also, in the book it says we are people who would not ordinarily hang out. I think that's very true. And if you come to AA and hang out with AA people, you'll be surprised who you fall in love with. And you will fall in love with people that you don't think you have much in common with. I have fallen in love with some people in AA before I knew who they voted for. I mean, these are very surprising things, you know. And Dr. Gill was one of these wonderful folks. He passed about 2 years ago. He was in his early 90s, but he got sober when General Eisenhower was president. And then he had a relapse under Mr. Kennedy. And then he got sober again with Lyndon Johnson. And Gill, as a sober physician, he grew up in French Canada and came to the graduated, became a doctor, moved into San Francisco, began his medical practice, and his alcoholism advanced, and he gets sober. And Gill was one of those eloquent people in French and English who could teach you a lot and well. And I would hear Gill talk about alcoholism, and I didn't know anything about alcoholism. Like I say, I grew up avoiding direct conversations about anything real. Gill said alcoholism is a disease that has 3 distinct phases. Phase 1 is the fun phase. This is when it's fun. Phase 2 is fun plus problems. It's still fun, but you start to have problems. And phase 3, problems. You know, the good times are gone. So the first step asks a pretty simple question, and the question is, are you still having any fun? And if the answer is yes, you might not be interested in hanging out with us. To want to join us, to think that we are worth hanging out with, you have to be a train wreck. If you still have self-respect and dignity, you're not going to find us very interesting. My sponsor calls this the gift of desperation. If you have the gift of desperation, we're fun. But otherwise, it's just, do I want to spend the rest of my life with those awful people? So I listened to Gill over the years, and my alcoholism is exactly like that. When I was a young person, I drank, and it was really fun. I was an awkward kid. I didn't think I fit in very well. I lived in my head a lot. I was pretty sure that my insides did not match your insides. But when I drank, I felt full of confidence and masculinity and adulthood and power, and I could do a lot of stuff. And that's at 14, 15, 16, and 17 years old. I also want to say I'm a drunk driver. I'm one of those people. I drove drunk for years and never killed anybody, never hurt anybody, but that's next time, you know. I heard a recording of Norm Alpe some years ago, and he was a very prominent AA speaker, I guess in the 50s and 60s. And he talked about his life and his story as being a matter of seconds and inches. A couple of seconds different, a couple of inches different, and it would be a real different story. And I keep that in mind when I think about my years of drunk driving. And I forget, you know, I hang out with drunks a lot, but also I occasionally go to other events. I was somewhere in San Francisco at a party. I don't go to those things. I'm socially awkward, so I don't go. Somehow the topic of drunk driving came up, and I think I was the only person in recovery in the room, and there was a rather elegant lady of a certain age standing next to me, and you know, the topic drunk driving. I said, "Oh, I did that for years." And she said, "You were a drunk driver?" And the temperature in the room just dropped, you know, to a freezing condition. We did not become friends. But But I like mentioning the drunk driving. The longer I'm sober, the more frightening the drunk driving stuff is for me. And can I mention a couple other mild fears, not big fears, mild fears that I occasionally have? Driving across bridges. Not always, but sometimes. New Year's Eve is a jumpy time for me, and where I live, we have a lot of bridges. And I have been asked to do things like, I live in Oakland, California, and there's a big, long bridge between Oakland and San Francisco. We rarely go there, we stare at them. We call them the West Bay, and it pisses them off, and it's just fun. But I would be asked, we're having a big New Year's Eve AA meeting and dance. Would you come and speak? And I was, the problem is, to get there, I'd have to cross the bridge. And if you could helicopter me over, it would be an easier thing. But anyway, I have gone. And then, the AA meeting's over at 10:30 and the big dance starts. And I just say, I'm leaving now. Because by 11:30 on that bridge, I couldn't cross it. The fear would just be so great. And I used to think that, well, surely this fear will go away as I get, but it doesn't. So I just respect it, and ask God for help and cross the bridge. I also have an occasional trouble with tunnels, but that's a whole other inventory. I had all the symptoms of alcoholism. We talk about blackouts. Oh, yeah. In high school, I was having blackouts. Earlier than that, perhaps even blackouts, I'm not sure. The only time I've ever had an accident, though, was drunk driving on my bike. And so I was maybe in the 7th or 8th grade, and I'd go home. I didn't want to deal with other kids. They got in the way, and I'm busy thinking. So I didn't live far from school, so I'd ride my bike home really fast and then have something to eat maybe, and maybe a drink. And a little bourbon or a little tequila that was around the house. And on one of those occasions, I do not remember leaving the house. I do not remember getting on my bike. I do not remember heading back to school. I do not remember the telephone pole. I do not remember the ambulance or the police. But evidently, I'd had a couple of social drinks and smacked into a tree, and the cops called my mom, and they said, Mrs. Weston, we have your son. So her first thought was my oldest brother had robbed a bank, because this is how we think in my house. And they said, no, it's your son Tommy. And what went wrong? And so they said, oh, there might be something wrong with the bike, and oh, there might be something wrong with the telephone pole, or oh, there might be something wrong with the street. They never asked, had he been drinking? Because when General Eisenhower was president, no one thought that 12-year-olds would be drinking, but I was. So that's the only accident I've ever had. A few years ago, I was asked to come and give a talk to high school people, to parents, about alcoholism. And I gave information, it's allergy of the body, obsession of the mind, symptoms, recovery, what it looks like. And we had 3 or 4 teenagers who were sober come with. And they're the ones they really need to hear, is kids who are clean and sober. But there I was, and one of the parents said, well, can't we prevent all this? Can't we just prevent all this happening? And I said, well, my experience was I had all of the